Hello, and let's talk about the coronavirus disease or COVID-19. We've been discussing the spread of this disease regularly on the show, but each day brings a new set of cases and a very varied set of responses as humanity as a whole struggles to deal with the scale of this disease. We have put the example of China, which has put into place a massive response mechanism that is finally bearing fruit. On the other hand, we have countries such as the United States where experts have been severely critical of the haphazard, scattered and confused response of authorities. Politics, economics, education, sport, there is no realm of life where this disease has not had an impact, and it raises very fundamental questions on the nature of our social organization itself. We will be talking about some of these aspects, but here is a quick update regarding the spread of COVID-19. The total number of coronavirus cases across the globe has gone up to 110,099. The number of deaths is 3,830. The total number of countries affected by COVID-19 at present is 109. There has been a sudden surge in the number of cases of coronavirus in Italy, with the death toll going up by 133 in just the past 24 hours, which brings the total toll to 366. The increase in cases has come as the Italian government imposed a lockdown on 14 provinces in the northern part of the country that is home to 16 million people. On the other hand, there are clear signs of the virus slowing down in China. Only 40 new cases were reported on Sunday. In India, the number of cases jumped to 43 over this weekend as new cases were reported from Jammu and Kashmir, Uttar Pradesh, Delhi and Kerala. No deaths have been reported in India so far. The economic impact is also being strongly felt. Stock markets across the world are either plunging or set to plunge over fears of a recession and an oil price war. Oil prices have crashed after OPEC countries failed to reach an agreement on cutting supply, and Saudi Arabia responded by slashing prices and indicating that it would increase production. We have with us Prashant from People's Dispatch, who's going to talk to us about the latest. So the world looks like it's really poised on the brink of a mega crisis. Prashant, what's happening?
So I would say that there are multiple angles to it. There are some bright spots, definitely. One is the fact that, like you pointed out, the number of cases in China is showing a steady decline. 40 new cases. Considering the situation 1 month ago, 40 new cases is a testament to the kind of success of the Chinese authorities' efforts, the kind of mass effort that was put into it. If you look at some of the videos, if you look at some of the news items, you can see the kind of, say, the new hospitals being constructed, the thousands of health professionals who were brought into Wuhan and Hubei as a whole, and the way in which the corridor, the isolation corridor was established, in terms of making sure that, and the discipline of the Chinese people also. So all these played a huge factor, and that's very, very clear. We can also see that South Korea has also seen a decline in cases, and there too there's been a huge number of tests conducted, which is very vital for dealing with this, because unless you hold a huge number of tests, you cannot identify clusters, and unless you identify clusters, you cannot
really control it.
Exactly, you cannot enforce isolation, and that is probably the most important thing that can be done right now. So there are those bright spots, definitely, and say countries, for instance, like Vietnam, many of them have successfully dealt with it. On the other hand, there is the other side of the picture. There's Europe, where the number of cases is ballooning, for lack of a better word. And Italy has imposed very strict measures. Arguably, it should have been done maybe 10 days ago, considering the way it is spread. And now the current death toll and the rise in the number of cases shows that this was, this was very much, it was not probably caught in time. And this is something that has been sort of brewing for some time. And now we are seeing it is probably peaking, or it may even go up further. And simultaneously, there's also the issue of France and Germany. France also seeing a rise in the number of cases. It's crossed 1,000, 1,100. And there are a number of deaths to Germany. And so far, no deaths, I think, but again, a considerable number of cases. And France, Germany, and Italy are very closely linked. For that matter, even Spain. And there are a few border controls in Europe. And the way in which, and in all these countries, community spread is happening, which means it's no longer necessarily, the spread is no longer restricted to people who have traveled from one location to the other. It's basically, it does not require that anymore. So that's usually considered a major stage in the spread of a disease. So in the coming weeks, I think the response of the European countries is going to be very, very crucial. Whether they'll be able to summon the same kind of discipline and the same kind of political will that the Chinese were able to summon to basically make sure that the lockdown is enforced
Very strictly.
very strictly. Because when China did this, it was convenient
Right.
for everyone to say that, oh, these are authoritarian measures.
Right.
And now, you see that all these countries now have a hard choice. So do they also respond with the same amount of discipline? Do the people in these countries have the kind of trust that in their governments and their political systems that help the Chinese? On the one hand, you can see that certain far-right groups in Europe are already trying to make this a political issue by saying that this is all about the migrants.
That's right.
So these are actually very big challenges for Europe as a whole. If you look at the United States, it's a very unknown scenario right now because
They were very slow to begin.
Exactly, that's one aspect of it. The number of tests, at least until a couple of days, it was around 2,000, which is abysmal. And the number of if you look at the number of deaths and the number of cases, the ratio is quite high, which is unusual, which is not matched the trend in many other parts of the world. So then the question is that is there a large number of cases that have not been tested and therefore not identified? In which case it's a huge risk as far as the government is concerned, and as far as the people are concerned. And there's a question of the CDC, which is Center for Disease Control and Management, which is an iconic institution in the US, subject to so many movies for that matter.
Yes.
Actually not being able to perform so well. The Trump administration's response itself has been partly denial, partly bravado and bragging. We controlled it before the situation even properly developed. So, and of course, there's a whole political angle to it. Trump, ahead of the elections, wanting to prove that he's on top of the situation. So the US is actually a big unknown. And if the number of cases in the US increases, considering the role it plays in the global economy, this could be a very, very dangerous situation that could be emerging. So it's really fingers crossed over the next couple of weeks because I think we can confidently say that China, which was the origin of the disease, has managed to bring it under control. But whether the Europeans and the Americans are able to do it is a very big question.
What about India, Prashant? Are we doing enough? There seems to be this phone message which everyone gets.
Right.
Is that going to...
I'm a bit unsure about how effective that is, except for... it's a good thing. I'm not going to deny it. But the key point is that in India, again, the question is in terms of transit points, in terms of scanning, in terms of testing. Again, question of discipline also.
Right.
Avoiding large gatherings, even if they're festivals or even if they're, occasions for community gathering or whatever, avoiding that deliberately and also in terms of making sure that the public health system at a district level in all the states, that's very important because there are states like Kerala which have already experience in dealing with, say, these kind of viruses, for instance, Nipah in 2018.
Right.
But there are states which we can be fairly sure are not really equipped as of now to deal with it. So for both the central and state governments, the key challenge is to ensure that all these governments are on the same page regarding this. The protocols are very clearly laid out and that there's very proactive measures to ensure the maximum number of testing. Because we do know that this usually does affect older people much more severely. Most of the victims are far more older people. But at the same time, we also do know that if treated at the right time, there's a very good possibility that people can be cured.
Right.
On the other hand, if it is not caught at the right time, what does happen is that the number of cases stresses the hospital infrastructure considerably. The hospital infrastructure begins to crumble. Caregivers are at increased risk of contracting the disease. And then it's a vicious loop. So the key question is that for each country, and especially India considering its population, its density of population, is where are we in that spectrum in terms of response. So if we respond too late, what happens is that we enter a vicious loop of the numbers increasing, the hospital infrastructure not being enough,
Right.
and then it gets worse. The other key aspect, I think, is that in India especially, there's a huge amount of misinformation being spread about how, say, certain traditional cures or how certain, Indian cultural ways of dealing with the disease are the best way to solve problems, and this is extremely dangerous. So, in fact, the WHO itself has said that there is a infodemic going around, which means people spreading all sorts of wrong information. And here, in some senses, that's accelerated by the fact that certain sections of the right wing have been going around propagating wrong information on, say, what are the kind of cures that can be, you know,
Right.
the kind of stuff that can cure, including people in power. And
Yes.
this is something that we need to be very careful about.
There was
And
this interesting thing which happened where I think, I don't know whether this is correct or not, but in the purportedly a Lok Sabha answer to a question, which tells you that, you know, these are the Unani and Ayurved medicines which give you symptomatic relief,
Right.
which means they don't really cure the problem, but people might end up thinking that if they're not sneezing.
Exactly. So a very important aspect is that the precautions that are suggested by the WHO, by medical authorities across the world are very clear. And a lot of it is centered around a self-isolation in case you're suspected of having the disease, hand washing, very basic fact, for instance.
Right.
And these are far more effective than many of these things that are being peddled. So I think that's a big challenge that we need to sort of confront very head on. And as far as India is concerned, we do have some amount of experience in dealing with, at least some of the states have some very good experience in dealing with such crises. And I
Okay.
think it's also the responsibility of the center to ensure that this experience is translated and transferred to other states as well.
All right. Now, you know, Prashant, the economic aspect of this particular disease, is it going to really affect the market as people are saying it will? Will there be a recession? These are all the concerns.
Right. So it's still a bit too early to say, because in a lot of these cases of epidemics, including in the death count, a lot of the information comes out over the years, much later. For instance, you have the swine flu epidemic in 2009-10, where the final death count was much, much higher but came out much later. Similarly, it's the same thing with the economic aspect also, because right now all the predictions are very, very rough. So for instance, the OECD has said that global growth may reduce by half to 1.5%, which is around recession. And there's already a lot of, say, conflict going on around oil. So
Right.
for instance, the OPEC countries have been trying to reach an agreement over cutting supplies so that they're all in a relatively safer position, and then failed to do that. So Saudi Arabia has responded by declaring that it will increase supplies. And now it's basically going to be a race to the bottom, because all these countries, every country is on its own. It's in some ways good for countries which depend on importing oil, but in terms of global markets, there are multiple implications for this. So we've seen the stock markets in all the Asian markets crash today morning considerably. As we move towards the later half of the day, when the European and US markets open, we're going to see something similar. And this usually has a chain reaction kind of an effect. So that's one aspect of it. The other key aspect, of course, lies in the fact that now that China, which is the hub of production in the world, many parts of it have been shut down. There is a lot of uncertainty over how this is going to actually impact jobs for that matter, and supplies. For instance, one interesting thing is that there's a huge amount of economic relations between China and the north of Italy.
Right.
So a lot of the production in the north of Italy is consumed by China in terms of luxury goods, in terms of, say, a lot of stuff. So on the other hand, there's a lot of Chinese products which come to India, for that matter, which come to other parts of the world, and all these have been closed. And I think, as Onindio was explaining in the show a couple of days ago, what happens is that their inventories run out. So you have a 2-month buffer for
Right.
electronic goods, for various other kinds of goods that come from China. And and now we're reaching the end of those 2 months. And people are slowly beginning to run out of this kind of inventory. So at a very micro level, this is one risk we face. And then suppose you sort of expand that picture and then take a look at what happens at a global level, the implications are quite dire, actually. So the question is whether governments can respond in a necessary way, which is by offering stimulus packages.
Okay.
So that would be one very strong possibility, that you sort of ensure that you throw more money into the system itself, so that you invest money in terms of projects, people don't lose jobs, and the economy somehow manages to survive. On the other hand, if governments continue, especially in Europe and the US, to follow austerity policies where they completely withdraw, we might be seeing a very dire scenario.
All right, Prashant. Thanks for that update. We now bring you a video featuring senior journalist Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay, where he discusses similar outbreaks that have happened in the past.
Going by the extent of media coverage in most institutions, it almost appears that communal violence never took place in Delhi barely days ago. There is no denying that there is a public health crisis with potential of assuming epidemic proportions in India and pandemic dimensions globally. Unfortunately, the government's handling of the challenge leaves much to be desired. Obviously, the government underestimated the risk. No efforts were made to increase diagnostic facilities. There is still just one institute equipped to test for coronavirus, the National Institute of Virology, Pune. Our quarantine facilities too are obsolete and unscientific. Even after several weeks, no overall comprehensive plan exists regarding evacuating Indians trapped in countries where the scale of the outbreak is much bigger. One word describes the Indian government's initial response: nonchalance. Now its handling of the issue has done little but create panic and shortage of black marketing of masks and hand sanitizers. Amid the challenge which India and the world faces, it is necessary to recall India's worst health epidemic 100 years ago. Called the Spanish flu, although there was nothing particularly Spanish about it, the influenza hit India between 1918 and 1920. It is estimated that 18 million Indians lost their lives to the virus or its complications. This was almost 6% of the Indian population of that time. Globally, Spanish flu took the lives of anything between 50 to 100 million people. This figure was estimated to be much more than both world wars put together. Although the epidemic first manifested itself in Europe in 1918, when the First World War ended, colonial authorities made little preparations. As a result, the disease became rampant in India the moment infected Indian troops returned from the front. The government also made little preparations, even though near-famine conditions left Indians in a state of perpetual hunger from the beginning of the 20th century. To top all this, the monsoon failed in 1918. In 2018, many discussions were held to mark the centenary of this forgotten pandemic. Evidently, no lessons were learnt.
In our next story, we go to Uttar Pradesh, where in a shocking act, the state government had put up hoardings to name and shame those accused of violence and fomenting violence in the anti-CAA protests. These hoardings have been put up in prominent locations in Lucknow, and they feature the names and the addresses of 53 people, including activist Sadaf Jafar and the former IPS officer S.R. Darapuri. On Sunday, the Allahabad High Court had taken suo motu cognizance of the issue and termed the act highly unjust. Now the High Court has said that these hoardings have to be taken off. It had called these acts an encroachment on personal liberty. The court had asked the district administration and the police authorities to explain why they had done this. To talk about this, we have Pranjal with us. Pranjal, a very unusual thing for a state government to do.
Yes, definitely. I mean, if you even look at the court judgment and what the court has said, the court said that right to privacy is a fundamental right, and basically by doing this, you're encroaching one personal liberty and also the right to privacy that individuals enjoy. They have set out precedent and they've given examples of various cases that have happened in the past, and the judgment clearly says that there are only limited conditions on which photograph and personal details of somebody who's accused of something is put out in the public. And what is the condition? The condition is if that person is absconding, not ready to surrender to the police, or is missing in terms of you're not able to recognize that person, so a fugitive poster is put out in the public domain, which we usually see even around Delhi when posters are put out for people who are either accused as militants of different other organizations. So apart from this, in no other condition the personal details of people should have been put out. The argument of the UP government was that because, I mean, they have followed certain rules, and because these persons have already been accused of this, that's why there was no problem of putting out their details in the public domain. To which the court has clearly replied that even if it is destruction of public property which they have been accused of, the crimes are not that which require an entire biodata or personal details of person to be put out in public. So in any case, this is clear violation of different norms that have been set out by the legal agencies and by the law in this country. Really absurd that you are putting out details of people who are activists, well-known activists, lawyers, journalists, theatre actors, who have been working in Lucknow for more than a decade or 2 decades on occasions, and they were the people who were, yes, they were part of the anti-CAA protests, but they have had, if you look at their record, they have had a clean record, right?
Right, absolutely.
And for example, Sadaf Zafar you talked about, Sadaf Zafar was filming what police was doing on that occasion and she was picked up. Deepak, he went to inquire about the people who were arrested in the police station and he was sent to the judicial custody. So this is what was happening in the state.
Now, Pranjal, also, if you look at these billboards, they are very expensive looking. The government has spent a certain amount of money, time, resources, public funds to do this.
Right.
And they did this earlier in order to recover money from a wider cross-section of society, the poorer people who had participated, the working class people. And, this is very, very unusual. If something does happen to any of these people now, will someone be responsible? It's sort of like giving a speech. And
so basically that's what we need to understand, that the kind of society we are witnessing right now all over India and especially in the northern India, the kind of mob mentality that has developed.
right.
By doing this, you put lives of these people at stake, right? You have people coming out. We have seen in the past that how different people accused of different crimes were attacked inside the court, outside the court. Dr. Talwar in Arushi murder case is one of the examples. He was attacked outside the court. Then we have an example of Kanhaiya who was beaten up by lawyers in the court, right?
Yes.
And these were the name faces. These were faces which people recognized.
Right.
So when you put out an entire list in the open areas, in public squares, basically you are inviting people to attack them. I mean, that's a kind of mentality that they're trying to develop. It's basically you're saying that, okay, these are people who have been accused of public property. These are anti-CAA protesters who, according to them, are anti-country, anti-nationals. So hence, somebody can come and beat them up. There's no problem in that. So one, that, and obviously the expenses part that you have mentioned. On one hand, you are sending recovery notices of crores and crores, and then you are doing the same thing to propagate that. I mean, that doesn't
with
make,
you, who the police had with them.
Yeah, I mean, that really doesn't make sense. Especially, I mean, the court clearly says that even if a person is a history cheater, and you require photos of that person, personal details of that person, it still has to be discreet and it can only be revealed when the court wants it. So the government doesn't seem to have followed any of these norms. So obviously these are the two basic problems that come out of this court, whether UP government will follow it. They have been given time till 16th of March to file a compliance report in the High Court. Are they going to appeal in the Supreme Court against it? We don't know. But looking at the track record of the Yogi government and the way they have been approaching this entire issue, doesn't look like that these hoardings are going down.
Okay, Pranjal, thanks for that update. And that's all we have today with Let's Talk. Tune in every day, 3 p.m. and keep watching. Thank you.